Hey there, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of Artin groups. You sent us some really interesting research on them, and, well, I'm ready to unpack it all. From what I'm seeing, we're going to uncover some seriously elegant math today.
Artin groups definitely have an elegance to them. They give us a glimpse into intricate patterns, symmetries, almost like a mathematical code underlying the structure of the universe, you could say.
A mathematical code? Okay, I'm hooked already. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. For those of us who haven't exactly, spent our days wrestling with algebraic equations, can you give us a simple explanation of what Artin groups are?
Imagine a set of building blocks, but these blocks, they have very specific rules about how they can connect. Some blocks might fit together perfectly, while others might only connect at certain angles or in specific sequences. These rules, what mathematicians call generators and relations, they dictate the possible arrangements, the intricate patterns those blocks can form. That's what Artin groups are all about. They're a way to represent these complex structures using a set of rules.
So, like a mathematical construction set, where the rules, they define the blueprint for what we can build. But instead of castles or spaceships we're building, well, what kind of structures are we talking about here?
That's the beauty of it. Artin groups, they can represent an incredible range of structures. Some describe intricate knots, the kind you might not want to encounter in your shoelaces.
Definitely not.
Others pop up in topology, that's the study of shapes and spaces, where a donut and a coffee mug are considered the same because they can be smoothly transformed into each other, without cutting or gluing.
Right.
Believe it or not, these groups even have applications in computer science. They can help us understand complex networks and algorithms.
Whoa, okay, we went from building blocks to knots, donuts, and computer code. That's quite a leap.
That's the thing about mathematics, everything's connected. And that's particularly true with Artin groups.
Now, the research you sent over, it mentioned something called property A-re. What's the significance of this property, and why are mathematicians so keen on figuring out which Artin groups have it?
Think of property R as a kind of mathematical fingerprint, one that helps us understand the behavior of a group. Groups with this property, they often exhibit a kind of chaotic and unpredictable behavior. Imagine trying to predict the weather. It's a system with so many variables that even small changes can lead to drastically different outcomes.
So we're talking about mathematical chaos theory here. Sign me up.
Exactly. Understanding this, well, you could call it mathematical weather. It's crucial, not just for mathematicians, but for anyone dealing with complex systems. In finance, for example, understanding chaotic systems can help us analyze market volatility and make more informed decisions.
Okay, now that's a connection I didn't see coming. So by studying Artin groups and their properties, like property R star, we're essentially gaining a deeper understanding of chaos itself.
Precisely. And as you can imagine, understanding chaos has implications for everything from predicting earthquakes to modeling the spread of diseases.
Okay, that's officially mind-blowing. But let's dive even deeper into these Artin groups. The research also mentions something called the Deligne complex. Now, I'll be honest, that sounds a bit intimidating, almost like something out of science fiction. Can you shed some light on this?
It does sound intimidating, doesn't it? But the Deligne complex is actually a tool mathematicians use to visualize Artin groups. Imagine a complex, multidimensional map. Each point on this map, it represents an element of the Artin group. And the paths between those points, they represent the relations between those elements, those rules that govern how they can connect.
So it's like we're taking something incredibly abstract, these rules and structures, and giving them a visual form, a shape we can almost wrap our heads around.
Exactly. And just like a map can reveal the shortest route between 2 points, the Deligne complex can help mathematicians understand the shortest, let's say, paths between elements within an Artin group, which in turn gives them insights into the group's overall structure.
That's incredible. But why is it so important to visualize these structures? What kind of insights can we gain from seeing them laid out this way?
By visualizing an Artin group through its Deligne complex, mathematicians can start to see patterns and connections that might not be obvious from the algebraic equations alone. For instance, they can start to see how complex structures emerge from the simple rules we talked about earlier. It's like looking at a beautiful tapestry. You can appreciate the intricate design, even if you don't understand the weaving techniques used to create it.
So it's about gaining a deeper, more intuitive understanding of these structures. Instead of just crunching numbers, we're seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important aspect of Artin groups, their automorphism group, specifically a subgroup called Auto-A. Now, I know that sounds like a mouthful.
Okay, yeah, that one almost made my head spin.
Yeah.
But you mentioned rules earlier. Does this have something to do with the rules governing these Artin groups?
You got it. Think of it like this. Every game has rules, right?
Oh,
Chess has different rules than, say, checkers, and those rules determine the possible moves and strategies. Auto, it's like looking at the rule book for an Artin group. It tells us about the permissible transformations, let's call them moves, that we can make within that group without changing its fundamental structure.
So it's about understanding the ways these structures can change and evolve while still retaining their essential identity. We're not just looking at the pieces on the board. We're figuring out the legal moves. Can you give us a specific example of what one of these moves might look like in this context?
Imagine playing chess and having a rule that lets you swap the positions of your king and queen, but just once during the game. That's a transformation that doesn't change the fundamental pieces of the game, but could dramatically alter your strategies and ultimately the game's outcome.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So by studying Artin, we're essentially analyzing the strategic possibilities within an Artin group. We're trying to understand how flexible these structures are, how much they can bend without breaking.
You've got it. It's like we're trying to crack the code of a complex puzzle, figuring out the subtle ways we can manipulate the pieces while staying within the rules. And what's amazing is that this seemingly abstract exploration can have far-reaching implications.
Now, you're really making me curious. What kind of implications are we talking about here? How does understanding the rulebook of Artin groups connect to the bigger picture?
Well, it turns out that understanding these transformations can give us insights into some of the most fundamental questions in mathematics, particularly in areas like topology. For example, mathematicians have found surprising connections between Artin groups and the study of knots. Remember those intricate knots we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah, the ones I'm hoping never to find in my shoelaces.
Yeah.
You're saying there's a connection between those knots and these abstract algebraic structures.
Exactly. You see, some Artin groups can be used to represent different ways of tying a knot. And by studying the transformations within these groups, those legal moves we talked about mathematicians can gain a deeper understanding of the different ways those knots can be untied or transformed.
So we're going from abstract algebra to the very tangible act of tying and untying knots. That's incredible. It seems like this exploration of Artin groups is leading us down a rabbit hole of interconnected mathematical concepts.
That's the beauty of mathematics. Everything is connected. And as we delve further into this research on Artin groups, we're going to uncover even more of these surprising connections, particularly as we start to explore the use of surfaces in understanding these abstract structures.
Okay, now you've piqued my curiosity even more. Surfaces, you say. This is where things get really interesting. But for that, we'll have to continue our exploration in the next part of the deep dive. Okay, so before we left off, we were kind of like teetering on the edge of this connection between Artin groups and surfaces. Now, that might sound like we're stretching things a bit. How can we represent these abstract algebraic structures, these rules for connecting blocks, using something as, well, tangible as a surface?
It's a fascinating leap, isn't it? But honestly, that's where the true beauty of mathematics often lies, in those unexpected connections between, seemingly totally different fields. Imagine taking a plain sheet of paper that's our surface. Now picture folding it, cutting it, even gluing parts of it together in specific ways. Each of these actions, these transformations on the surface, they can be represented mathematically.
So we're talking about like origami on a whole new level here.
Precisely. Though instead of paper cranes, we're creating mathematical representations of Artin groups. You see, certain Artin groups can be directly linked to specific transformations on surfaces. Think about like stretching a rubber band around a cylinder, that's a transformation. Or imagine sliding the edges of a piece of paper together to form a Mobius strip. That's another one. These actions, when described mathematically, can correspond directly to the elements and relations within an Artin group.
Okay, so we're taking those legal moves we talked about earlier, those transformations within an Artin group, and giving them a physical form, a way to actually visualize them on a surface. That's pretty ingenious, but how does this actually help us understand these groups any better?
By, let's say, translating Artin groups into the language of surfaces, we can use the tools of geometry and topology to study their properties. It's like, looking at a problem through a different lens sometimes. By changing your perspective, you can see solutions that were hidden before.
So it's about finding the right language, the right framework, to unlock the secrets of these complex structures.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, that language happens to be the language of surfaces. Now, you mentioned something before before we took a break called Penner's construction. Did this have something to do with this whole surface business?
Absolutely. Penner's construction, it's like having a special set of tools, a toolbox specifically designed to build these surface transformations that correspond to Artin groups. It provides a way to translate the algebraic rules of an Artin group into precise geometric instructions for how to manipulate a surface.
So with Penner's construction, we're not just randomly folding and cutting paper here. We're following a specific set of blueprints to create surfaces that perfectly embody the properties of a given Artin group.
That's a great way to put it. And what's really fascinating is that by studying these surfaces, mathematicians are starting to see, hints of even deeper connections, leading to some truly mind-boggling conjectures about Artin groups and their properties, particularly that intriguing property R we discussed earlier.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity with these mind-boggling conjectures. What are we talking about here? What kind of mysteries are mathematicians hoping to solve using these surfaces and Artin groups?
Well, remember how we talked about property R being like a mathematical fingerprint, a way to classify groups based on their, chaotic behavior?
Absolutely. It's like trying to predict which raindrops will cause a ripple effect in a pond, a glimpse into the unpredictable nature of complex systems.
Exactly. Now, imagine if we could predict that chaotic behavior, not just in, say, raindrops or weather patterns, but in any complex system. That's the kind of power that understanding property R could unlock.
Whoa, that's a pretty big if. But you're saying that studying Artin groups and their surfaces might hold the key to understanding chaos itself.
It might sound a little far-fetched, but that's what these conjectures suggest. Mathematicians are starting to suspect that there's a deeper connection between property R and the geometry of the surfaces we've been discussing. Imagine, for instance, that the way a surface is, curved or twisted could tell us something about the chaotic behavior of the Artin group it represents.
So we're not just talking about pretty shapes here. We're talking about the very shape of chaos itself, encoded in these surfaces.
Yes, sir.
Intense.
Yeah.
Are you saying there's a chance these conjectures could revolutionize our understanding of complex systems across various fields?
It's definitely a possibility, though we're still in the very early stages of this exploration. The conjectures we're talking about, they're like uncharted territories on a map. They hint at a vast interconnected landscape of mathematical ideas, but we're still figuring out how to navigate it.
And that navigation, that exploration, that's what mathematics is all about, isn't it? But I have a feeling that this journey into the world of Artin groups is far from over. We've gone from building blocks to surfaces to potentially unlocking the secrets of chaos itself. What else is in store for us as we dive even deeper into this research?
Well, one of the most exciting avenues of exploration, it involves understanding how these conjectures connect to other areas of mathematics. For instance, there's a growing body of research exploring the links between Artin groups and a fascinating area of mathematics called geometric group theory.
Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down for me. What is geometric group theory, and how does it tie into everything we've been discussing?
In a nutshell, geometric group theory, it seeks to understand groups, those mathematical structures we've been talking about, by studying their actions on geometric spaces. Remember how we've been visualizing Artin groups as transformations on surfaces? Well, geometric group theory takes that idea and, let's just say, runs with it, exploring how groups can act on a much wider range of geometric objects, from trees to, get this, hyperbolic spaces, which are, they're spaces with a kind of negative curvature that leads to some very strange and counterintuitive properties.
Okay, so we're going from flat surfaces to trees and warped, mind-bending spaces. My brain might need a break after this.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in, but that's what makes this whole area of research so exciting. It's pushing the boundaries of what we thought we knew about groups and geometry, revealing connections we never, ever could have imagined.
It sounds like we're on the verge of a whole new understanding of not just Artin groups, but of mathematics itself. But before we get lost in the multiverse of geometric group theory, let's bring it back down to earth for a moment. What are some of the specific questions that mathematicians are hoping to answer by exploring these connections between Artin groups, surfaces, and geometric group theory? What are the big unknowns that are driving this research forward?
One of the most fundamental questions, it revolves around the classification of Artin groups. You see, just like we can classify animals into different species based on their shared characteristics, mathematicians want to classify Artin groups into different families based on their properties and structures.
So we're looking for the family tree of Artin groups. That makes sense. But how do surfaces and geometric group theory help us create this family tree?
That's where things get really interesting. You see, mathematicians have discovered that certain properties of an Artin group, like whether or not it possesses property or can be directly linked to the geometric properties of the surfaces it can act on. For example, if an Artin group can be represented by transformations on a, let's say, on a sphere, it might have very different properties than an Artin group that can only be represented on a surface with, with many holes, like a donut with several holes punched through it.
So the shape of the surface, its topology, as you mathematicians like to call it, can give us clues about the underlying structure and behavior of the Artin group. It's like the surface is a mirror reflecting the group's hidden characteristics.
That's a great way to think about it. And by studying these connections between Artin groups, surfaces, and geometric group theory, mathematicians hope to develop a more complete classification system for these fascinating algebraic structures.
It sounds like we're starting to piece together a much larger puzzle here, a puzzle that connects abstract algebra, geometry, and potentially even our understanding of complex systems in the real world.
Exactly. And the more we explore these connections, the more we realize how much more there is to discover. It's a journey that's constantly pushing the boundaries of mathematical knowledge.
This is incredible. We've uncovered a whole network of interconnected ideas, from building blocks and chaotic systems to surfaces and mind-bending spaces. But this is the deep dive, and we're not done yet. We've got to unpack what this all means, right?
Absolutely. While we've covered an incredible amount of ground, it's important to take a step back and consider the broader implications of this research and what it tells us about the nature of mathematics itself.
Okay, then let's take that step back. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the world of Artin groups? What should our listeners be pondering as we move into the final part of this deep dive? So we've journeyed through this incredible landscape of Artin groups, from their basic building blocks to their surprising connections with surfaces, chaos theory, and even, the fabric of space itself. I have to say, my mind is thoroughly bent, in the best way possible, of course.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. But that's the beauty of this area of mathematics, It constantly, challenges our assumptions and pushes us to expand our understanding of what's possible.
Speaking of pushing boundaries, you mentioned that this research, it could have some really far-reaching implications, even even beyond the world of pure mathematics. What are some of the potential real-world applications of this work?
Well, remember how we talked about property R and its connection to chaotic systems?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like trying to predict which snowflake will trigger an avalanche, understanding the subtle factors that can amplify small changes into major events.
Exactly. And that kind of understanding, it has huge implications in fields like, for example, climate science, where predicting the behavior of complex systems is, it's crucial. By studying Artin groups and their properties, we might gain new insights into the dynamics of, say, weather patterns, ocean currents, and even the long-term effects of climate change.
So by delving into this abstract world of Artin groups, we might actually gain a better understanding of the very real and urgent challenges facing our planet. That's incredible. What other fields could benefit from this research?
The potential applications, they're vast. In cryptography, for example, understanding complex group structures like Artin groups, it could lead to the development of new, more secure encryption algorithms.
Okay, so we're talking about potentially revolutionizing cybersecurity as well. It seems like the more we explore Artin groups, the more connections we uncover to other fields and disciplines.
That's the power of fundamental research, and often leads to unexpected breakthroughs in seemingly unrelated areas. And that's what makes this whole field so exciting.
So where do we go from here? What are the big unanswered questions, the mysteries that mathematicians are still trying to unravel in the world of Artin groups?
Well, one of the most, let's say, enduring mysteries, it revolves around that elusive property R. So we've talked about its connection to chaos and its potential implications for understanding complex systems. But the question of which Artin groups possess this property, that remains a major open problem in mathematics.
It's like we found this incredibly powerful tool, but we're still figuring out how to use it to its full potential. What are some of the approaches that mathematicians are taking to tackle this problem and other open questions in the field?
One promising approach involves using those geometric tools we discussed earlier, surfaces, hyperbolic spaces, and the tools of geometric group theory. By visualizing and manipulating these groups in these geometric realms, mathematicians hope to gain new insights into their properties and potentially unlock the secrets of property RD.
It's like we're trying to solve a four-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, and we keep finding new pieces, new ways to fit them together. But as with any good puzzle, there's always the possibility of a surprise ending, a twist we never saw coming.
Precisely. And that's what makes this whole area of research so captivating. It's a journey into the unknown, guided by curiosity, intuition, and the sheer joy of mathematical exploration.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
And after this incredible deep dive, I can't help but wonder if such complex and fascinating structures can emerge from a few simple mathematical rules, what other wonders are still hidden within the vast universe of mathematics? What other unexpected connections? What other mind-bending concepts are just waiting to be discovered?
That's the beauty of mathematics. It's an endless frontier of exploration. Every question we answer, it opens up a dozen new ones each more intriguing than the last.
And who knows, maybe one of our listeners, inspired by this deep dive, will be the one to make the next big breakthrough, to unlock a new secret of Artin groups, or perhaps uncover a whole new mathematical universe we never even knew existed.
Now, wouldn't that be something? It's a reminder that even in the most abstract realms of mathematics, there's always the potential for discovery and wonder.
Well said. A huge thank you to you for being our guide on this incredible journey into the world of Artin groups.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always a joy to share the elegance and excitement of mathematics.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on another deep dive. We'll see you next time, ready to explore a new corner of the cosmos of knowledge. Keep those questions coming and keep exploring.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into the world of abstract algebra. Specifically, Artin groups. We received a research paper from you all, Property R. Shah, for new classes of Artin groups, and we're going to break it down.
Yeah, we're going to decode all that complex math for you, and the really cool part, we'll explore how it connects to other areas like topology. It's not just some abstract math problem. This stuff actually has real-world implications.
Okay, so the paper dives into something called twisted conjugacy. What is that?
Well, to explain that, let's start with a simple analogy. Imagine shuffling a deck of cards.
Okay, like rearranging things.
Exactly. That's like regular conjugacy, just rearranging it. Now, picture doing that in a funhouse mirror, where the reflections twist and change how you rearrange those cards. That's kind of like twisted conjugacy, a unique way of rearranging things based on certain rules.
Okay, I think I get it. So why is this twisted rearrangement important?
What's interesting is that this twisted conjugacy isn't just some mathematical oddity. It pops up in different fields and has real-world implications.
Real-world implications. Now you've got me interested. Tell me more.
So think about robotics. Imagine programming a robot arm to navigate a cluttered room without hitting anything.
Okay.
There's something called Nielsen-Reidemeister fixed point theory, which helps calculate the points in space that stay fixed during movement, to prevent those collisions. Well, it turns out twisted conjugacy is a key part of understanding these fixed points.
So it's helping robots navigate. That's pretty cool. I bet that's not all, though.
You're right. It also shows up in cryptography. Arthur-Selberg theory, which is all about number theory, uses this twisted concept and has connections to code breaking. And it even pops up in Galois cohomology. That's a way to study solutions to equations, which again ties back to cryptography.
Wow, this isn't just theoretical then. It has connections to our technological world. How do these Artin groups that the paper's about fit into all of this?
Artin groups are at the core of this research, and they're based on this idea of braids. Think about braiding strands of hair.
Okay, I can picture that.
The way you interweave those strands makes different patterns, right? Artin groups are kind of like those patterns. Each one is defined by specific rules about how you can interweave or braid things together.
It's like discovering new braiding patterns, but instead of hair, we're braiding math concepts.
Yeah, and we categorize different braiding styles. Mathematicians classify Artin groups spherical large type, free of infinity hyperbolic type. And this paper focuses on proving something called property Rn for some new types of Artin groups.
So they're looking at certain mathematical braids, these Artin groups, and trying to prove something about them. But before we get into that, can we go back to property Artin? What does that even mean? What does it mean for a group to have that property?
So property R basically means a group has an infinite number of ways to do those funhouse mirror rearrangements, those twisted conjugacy classes we were talking about earlier.
So like infinite ways to shuffle the cards in that crazy mirror.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're trying to prove that these particular types of Artin groups have this property of infinite twisted rearrangements. But why is that important? What's so special about property Artin? It seems pretty abstract.
That's a good question. And it's important to know why mathematicians get so excited about something like property R show. Think about prime numbers. They might seem abstract at first, but they're the building blocks of all whole numbers, and they underpin so much of mathematics. They even have uses in cryptography.
Okay.
Property Arche is similar. It's a fundamental property of these groups that can help us understand their structure and how they connect to other mathematical ideas.
So it's all about finding these hidden connections within math.
Yeah. And the methods these mathematicians used to actually prove property Arche for these Artin groups. Super clever. They found a way to think about Artin groups as like transformations of surfaces.
Hold on, transformations of surfaces. Now we're going from braids to like messing with some kind of mathematical sheet.
Exactly. Imagine a rubber sheet, okay? And it's got a few punctures in it. Now picture stretching it, twisting it, even wrapping it around itself. These actions are basically transformations mathematically. What these mathematicians did was find a way to represent each Artin group as a special set of these transformations on the surface.
So each Artin group is like a special way of stretching and like contorting that rubber sheet. It's like each braiding pattern has its own way of manipulating this sheet.
That's a really great way to think about it. It shows the connection between these abstract algebraic structures and something more visual topology.
Yeah.
You know, the study of surfaces and how they change.
This is blowing my mind. How does this rubber sheet thing help prove anything about property R, though? It still seems like a big jump.
It's all about the tools mathematicians use. To analyze surfaces, they use something called a curve complex. Think of it like a map of the subway.
Okay.
Each station on the map represents a curve on that rubber sheet we were talking about. And the connections between the stations show how those curves intersect.
So I'm picturing a subway map now with stations representing these curves.
Okay, now imagine each Artin group with its own special set of transformations. It acts on this subway map, moving the stations around based on its own rules.
So they're like shuffling those subway stations based on how each Artin group stretches and plays with that rubber sheet.
Yes. By studying how these transformations from the Artin group affect the curve complex, like how they rearrange those subway stations, mathematicians can figure out if that Artin group has property array.
So if the Artin group makes enough chaos on that subway map, enough rearranging, it has property array.
You got it. They needed to find transformations that really messed up that curve complex to create this like infinite mixing of the stations. They used something called Penner's construction to do that.
Penner's construction sounds like blueprints for mathematical chaos. What is it?
It's a method for constructing special surface transformations. They're called pseudo-Anosov transformations. Imagine stretching and folding dough that gives you a basic idea of what a pseudo-Anosov transformation does to our rubber sheet. They make this mixing turning action.
So they're finding a specific kneading technique for each Artin group that creates the most chaos on that subway map. And if the kneading is chaotic enough, it has property R.
Exactly. And the coolest part, this approach of using surfaces and these transformations gives us a visual, intuitive way to understand a very abstract idea, property R ship.
It's like they created a whole new language to understand these Artin groups, translating between braid surfaces and subway maps. It's incredible how connected math is.
Absolutely. And this research is a perfect example of how mathematicians are always pushing the limits of what we know, making connections between different areas of math to discover amazing things.
So using this approach, these mathematicians were able to prove that all these new types of Artin groups have this property Arches.
They had a lot of success. Yeah, using this connection between surfaces and Artin groups, they show that a whole bunch of Artin groups of type Dn, specifically when an n is greater than 6, have property Arche. But there's one specific case they couldn't quite figure out using these tools, the AD5 Artin group.
So even in math, there are still mysteries to uncover. It's like they mapped out a whole new continent, but there's this one island they haven't explored yet.
That's a great way to think about it. And exploring that island could lead to all sorts of interesting findings. This one unresolved case shows us how much more there is to learn about these Artin groups.
It really is exciting to think about those uncharted territories in math, even in an area that seems so well-defined. But even though they didn't solve everything, I'd imagine this research opens up some really exciting possibilities for more exploration. Did they mention any specific paths for future research?
They did. They actually proposed two big conjectures in their conclusion that could change how we understand Artin groups, and maybe even beyond.
Two big conjectures. Now I'm interested. Tell me more about these mathematical mysteries.
So the first one, conjecture R, asks a pretty profound question. Can you tell if a group has property Rj just by looking at whether it's solvable by finite?
Solvable by finite sounds kind of intimidating. Can you maybe break that down a bit?
Of course. Think of a knot. Some knots are easy to untie, right? Others are super complex. Now imagine trying to figure out if you can untie a knot in a certain number of steps just by looking at it. That's kind of what conjecture is getting at, but with these abstract groups instead of knots. It's asking if there's a way to tell if they can be untangled in a certain way just by looking at their properties.
So it's like searching for a hidden rule book, some way to know how a group will act based on how it's structured.
Exactly. It's all about finding those elegant underlying rules that govern these mathematical objects. Now, the second conjecture, NA, that one takes us into the world of non-immutable groups. Don't worry too much about the name for now.
As long as we don't have to get into the technical weeds, I'm good. What's so special about these non-immutable groups? What does the conjecture say about them?
Well, this conjecture basically asks if property Ra is always true for a certain type of non-immutable group. It's like trying to find a universal law, but in the world of math. If it turns out to be true, it would be a huge step in understanding these types of groups.
So pushing the limits of what we know, looking for those universal truths hidden within math.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so fascinating. It's not just about solving a single problem. It's about creating new paths for exploring and asking these bigger questions about the very nature of math.
This whole deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've gone from braiding hair to surfaces, subway maps, and these fascinating Artin groups. It's really amazing how even in pure math, the pursuit of knowledge leads to such unexpected and interconnected discoveries.
It really shows you the power of mathematical thinking, finding patterns and connections where others might only see abstract symbols. And you never know, maybe someday these discoveries will lead to breakthroughs in areas we haven't even imagined yet.
It's a great reminder that learning is an ongoing adventure full of surprises and endless possibilities. We started by talking about how mathematicians use surfaces to help us understand these Artin groups, but there's so much more to explore. Could we even reverse it? Could we use what we're learning about Artin groups to find out new things about surfaces and the spaces they create? It's something to think about as you explore the incredible world of mathematics.
You know, it always strikes me how much math shapes our world, even if we don't see the equations themselves. It's like this hidden language underlying everything.
It really is. And today, we're diving into a paper that explores a pretty fascinating corner of that language, the world of Artin groups.
Property R for new classes of Artin groups.
Yeah.
Definitely not something you hear every day.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, but the ideas underneath are really elegant when you get down to it.
So no pressure on you then. But for those of us who might not be totally up on our abstract algebra, what are Artin groups in the first place? I feel like we need a starting point.
Okay, so imagine you have a set of rules for how things can combine. Like, think about DNA. It has those 4 base pairs, and there are very specific ways they can link up.
Right, A's with T's, and C's with G's if memory serves.
Exactly. So Artin groups are similar, but instead of base pairs, we're talking about actions. Different Artin groups have different grammars for how these actions can be combined.
So like a rule book, but for actions instead of words.
Exactly. And what makes them so interesting is that these actions can represent all sorts of things in mathematics, from geometric transformations to algebraic operations.
So there's this hidden structure underneath, and these rules, these Artin groups, help us understand how it all fits together.
You've got it. And this paper we're looking at today, it doesn't just analyze individual Artin groups, it tackles whole families of them.
Families.
Yeah. Like, imagine trying to understand shared traits across different species. That's kind of what this paper does, but for these mathematical objects. It's pretty neat, actually.
So it's building on this whole legacy of mathematicians trying to wrangle these groups, figure out their secrets.
And they're making some serious headway, too.
Okay, I'm hooked. But now we have to address the elephant, or maybe the abstract mathematical object in the room. This property R, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that.
You got it right. And yeah, I know, it sounds kind of intimidating.
Like something out of Star Trek.
A little bit,
Excellent.
but at its core, property R is a way to measure how much you can stir up a mathematical group without changing its fundamental nature.
Okay, give me a visual here. Stir up how?
Imagine you're rearranging furniture in a room. You can move things around, but the room itself, the walls and floor, those stay the same.
Okay, I'm with you.
Property R is about whether, by shuffling the elements of a group in a particular way, you can create infinitely many distinct rearrangements of that room.
So it's like
Yeah.
someone comes in after you've arranged things and rearranges them according to specific rules every time, and we're trying to see if they can make endless different layouts, even if the furniture stays the same.
That's a great way to put it. In mathematical terms, we call these rearrangements twisted conjugacy classes. It's about whether there are infinitely many of these classes.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. But why is this so important to mathematicians? Why do we care how much we can rearrange these groups? What does it actually tell us?
That's the million-dollar question. It all boils down to understanding the nature of these Artin groups. Do they have a lot of flexibility, like our room with endless rearrangements? Or are they more rigid, with only a few possible configurations?
So it's less about the rearranging itself and more about what the rearranging reveals about the group's underlying rules. Like, are they super strict or kind of loosey-goosey?
Precisely. Property R helps us classify and analyze these groups, revealing their hidden structures and how they relate to other mathematical concepts. It's like having a new tool to peek behind the curtain of the mathematical universe.
So property R is like this measuring stick, helping us figure out where these Artin groups fall on the spectrum from rigid to flexible.
And that's where this paper we're deep diving into gets really exciting, actually. They actually managed to prove that several new families of Artin groups do have this property.
So they're expanding our knowledge, adding to the map of what we know about these groups.
Exactly. Think of it like those old maps where they'd have, here be dragons. They've basically filled in some of those blank spots.
Love that. So they've charted these previously unknown territories. And what did they find there?
Well, it turns out these weren't just any old blank spots they filled in. These were families of Artin groups that had mathematicians stumped for quite a while. Really tricky to get a handle on.
So they were like those really tough jigsaw puzzles where the pieces all look the same.
Kind of. But by proving they have this property aria, they've given us new tools, new ways to understand them.
Okay, so major breakthrough. Now, I know we can't get into all the nitty-gritty details of the paper, but what would you say are the most important takeaways? If our listeners only remember two things, what should they be?
Two things. Okay. Let's see. The first one would have to be their work on something called DN Artin groups.
DNRA, right? Those were one of the families they looked at.
And remember how each family has its own kind of structure, its own set of rules. This theorem is like finding the blueprint that connects all the buildings in the DN family.
So by understanding this one blueprint, we suddenly get insights into a whole bunch of different structures.
Yeah.
It's like a master key.
Exactly. It's a fundamental truth about all DN Artin groups, which is a pretty big deal in the math world.
Big deal. Got it.
Yeah.
But they didn't stop there, did they? There was another family they tackled, large type Artin groups, if I'm remembering right.
You've got a great memory. And yeah, those were a whole other beast.
I bet. Those are the ones with the super complicated rules, right? Like a rule book with 1,000 footnotes.
That's a great way to put it. Where some Artin groups might have really straightforward interactions, large type Artin groups are more like those intricate clockwork mechanisms. Tons of moving parts, all interconnected.
And yet, they still managed to prove that these large type Artin groups can have property RMNO. That seems like a Herculean feat.
It definitely wasn't easy. But what's even more amazing is that these weren't just any large type Artin groups. These were types that had never been successfully analyzed in this way before. New territory entirely.
So, not only did they tame the wild beast, they tamed a species of beast no one had even encountered before. That's incredible. But how did they do it? What kind of mathematical wizardry did they use?
Well, they definitely didn't just stumble on it. They use a really clever approach, a combination of different mathematical tools. Think of it like a master chef using all sorts of different techniques to create this amazing dish.
Okay, so what were some of the key ingredients in this mathematical feast?
One of the big ones was this idea of embedding groups into geometric spaces.
Hold on. Geometry. I thought we were talking about algebra here.
Right. It seems like a jump, but it's actually a really elegant way to visualize these abstract groups.
Okay, walk me through it.
So imagine taking a piece of music, something you hear, something that exists in time. Now imagine translating that into sheet music, something you can see, something spatial.
Ah, so they're giving these abstract groups a physical form,
Yeah.
something they can actually manipulate and analyze.
Precisely. And by doing so, they're able to uncover relationships and patterns that wouldn't be visible otherwise. It's a powerful technique for bringing hidden structures to light.
Like they're shining a spotlight on these mathematical objects, revealing their secrets.
And that's really what makes this paper so groundbreaking. It's not just about the specific results, it's about the new avenues it opens up for exploring the mathematical world.
So they're taking these abstract concepts and grounding them in a way that makes them easier to grasp, even for us non-mathematicians.
That's the beauty of math, though. It's all about finding those connections, those bridges between seemingly different ideas.
But even with these powerful tools, it sounds like there was one Artin group that remained a bit elusive, right? The DeFi Artin group.
Uh-huh.
Kind of has a ring to it, doesn't it?
Yeah. But also a great example of how even within a family, you can have those black sheep.
Black sheep, huh?
Well, the ones that don't quite follow the rules make you scratch your head a bit.
So even though they figured out this blueprint for DN Artin groups in general, this DeFi one was like, nope, not playing by your rules.
It's more like they found the general layout of the house, but this one room was still locked up tight.
Intriguing. So were they able to figure out anything about the DeFi Artin group? Or was it a total dead end?
Oh, no, it wasn't a dead end at all. In fact, they have a strong hunch that the DeFi Artin group does have property Ardura. It's just that proving it rigorously is a bit trickier than they anticipated.
Ah, so it's like they have the pieces of the puzzle, but they haven't quite figured out how to fit them all together yet.
Exactly. It might be that the tools they use for the other groups need a little tweaking, or maybe it calls for a whole new approach. And that's the exciting part. This paper isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning of a new chapter.
I like the way you think. So it's like they've drawn this amazing map, but they've left a few blank spots for future explorers to fill in.
And those blank spots are often the most enticing, don't you think? The ones that make you want to grab your compass and set off into uncharted territory.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that math isn't just about memorizing formulas, it's a dynamic process of discovery.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This paper is a perfect example of that they've pushed the boundaries of what we know, but they've also opened up so many new questions to explore. For instance, they focused on Artin groups, but what about other types of mathematical groups? Could they have this property R too?
Now we're really cooking. So many possibilities, so many potential connections waiting to be made.
And that's what makes this whole field so exciting. There's always more to discover, more to learn. Who knows what breakthroughs are just around the corner?
It's like we've only just dipped our toes into this vast, intricate ocean of mathematics. There's a whole universe out there. Well, on that note, I think we've done our deep dive for today. A huge thank you to our expert for illuminating this fascinating corner of the math world.
The pleasure was all mine. Always happy to talk about math.
And to our listeners, we hope this has sparked your curiosity. Until next time, keep those minds open and keep exploring.
Hey deep divers, ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling Artin groups, and let me tell you, these things are wild.
Wild is an understatement. They sound abstract, but just wait till we get into their uses. We're looking at a paper called Property Artin Group for New Classes of Artin Groups today.
Our infinity. Okay, you're already losing me.
Don't worry, we'll break it down. First though, what exactly is an Artin group? Think of it like building with Legos, but for math.
Okay, so like Legos have instructions, Artin groups are the rules for how stuff connects in math.
Exactly. They're like blueprints for building mathematical structures. And just like with Legos, different rules mean you can build all sorts of things. Some Artin groups are simple, some get really complex, and they pop up in all sorts of areas of math.
Huh, like a hidden language connecting everything. But why should we care? What makes these rules so special?
It's all about potential. Seriously, these things can be huge in cryptography, computer science, maybe even physics. And the key is this R infinity thing.
You're going to have to elaborate on that one.
Right, so imagine you're flipping a square. Yeah, you can flip it horizontally or rotate it. Some flips end up looking the same, right? R infinity means when you do certain things to an Artin group, every single change is unique. It's constantly becoming something new.
So not just flipping a shape, more like it morphs into something totally new each time, forever.
You got it. And finding something in math that does that, that's a big deal.
Okay, I'm officially intrigued, but how does this infinite flip thing actually matter outside of math class?
Ever wish your online data was, like, truly unhackable? That's one way this research could go.
Wait, hold on. Abstract math equals a safer internet, and now you're speaking my language.
Cryptography relies on things that are hard to predict, right? And these unique transformations, that's exactly what we need for new, stronger codes.
So weirder math, safer browsing, I'm following.
Yeah.
But this research didn't stop there, did it? I heard something about using surfaces.
It gets even cooler. To figure out these Artin groups, mathematicians started picturing them as actions on a surface.
Like a piece of paper.
More like, imagine a rubber sheet. Yeah. You can stretch it, twist it, even poke some holes in it. Each Artin group is like a different way of messing with that sheet.
Hold up, poking holes. How does that play into the math?
Changing the surface, like adding holes, totally changes how everything in the Artin group relates to each other. It's like messing with the rules of the game.
So instead of just Legos, it's Legos on a trampoline, and someone keeps changing how bouncy it is. All right, I'm hooked. How did they actually use these holy surfaces to prove this R infinity thing for these Artin groups?
That's where this thing called the Deligne complex comes in. Sounds kind of sci-fi, but it's basically a way to make a map of the Artin group so we can actually see what's going on.
Okay, so we've got rubber sheets, holes, and now we're adding maps to the mix. My brain's starting to feel like that rubber sheet, stretched a little thin.
I promise, it's simpler than it sounds. Remember, it's all about relationships, right? How those Lego blocks connect. The Deligne complex lets us actually see those connections, like a big web. Every point on the map is like a different transformation, and the lines show how they all link up.
So instead of just randomly poking holes in the dark, the Deligne complex gives us a set of blueprints. We can see how each poke, each change, affects the whole structure.
Exactly. It's crazy powerful for understanding how these like deceptively simple rules can spiral into really complex results.
Yeah.
And this paper, they used it to prove definitively that these new Artin groups have the R infinity property.
So they use this map, this Deligne thing, to show that these Artin groups can really do that infinite flip thing we were talking about.
Exactly. By looking at how the Deligne complex is put together, they can demonstrate that certain actions on the surface, they have to create infinitely many unique outcomes, which means R infinity, baby. It's like one change kicks off this whole chain reaction that never repeats itself.
Mind officially blown. We went from what felt like pure abstract math to like unbreakable codes, and now we're visualizing surfaces and maps. If I'm following this right, what's the big takeaway for someone like me? Not a mathematician, but definitely along for the ride.
I think the coolest part is this research is blowing the roof off of what we thought math could do. Like discovering a whole new continent, but it's made of numbers and shapes instead of, land. This paper, it shows that R infinity, this thing we thought was super rare, it might be way more common and way more powerful than we ever realized.
We've talked cybersecurity, but where else could this research go? What other doors does it open?
Oh man, all over the place. Think computer science. Algorithms, the things that make software work, they're all about being efficient, finding the best solution, right? Understanding how to build things with R infinity could mean a whole new generation of algorithms. AI, data analysis, who knows what else.
So safer internet plus smarter computers, just from figuring out some weird math, I'm sold. But if this property is that big of a deal, why are we just figuring it out now? What took so long to crack this code, so to speak?
That's the thing about math, right? It's like exploring a jungle, but instead of trees and vines, it's numbers and equations. We've been hacking away at the edges, finding cool stuff like Artin groups, but to really go deep, we need new tools. This research, it shows how powerful these tools can be, like the Deligne complex. Plus, it takes some serious brain power to even picture this stuff.
So new tools, new ways of seeing, and we're finally uncovering the best secrets this mathematical jungle has to offer.
You got it. And get this, even with this breakthrough, there's still so much we don't know. Like, we climbed one mountain, and now we see a whole mountain range we never even knew existed.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. What kind of mysteries are we talking about? What's left to figure out about these Artin groups and their infinite flip potential?
Remember those holy surfaces, the ones we were stretching and poking? Well, one big question is, do all Artin groups, even the really crazy ones, still have that R infinity thing going on?
So you're saying there might be Artin groups out there that don't have that infinite flip potential? Like if you poke too many holes in the rubber sheet, it breaks.
That's the million-dollar question. It's possible that some Artin groups, maybe with certain kinds of surfaces or connections, just don't work that way. Like maybe there's a way to arrange those holes that locks the sheet into a set number of shapes.
That'd really shake things up. What would it mean if we found some Artin groups that don't have this special property?
It means our understanding's not complete yet. Like the rule book for Artin groups is even more complicated than we thought. It wouldn't be that everything we know is wrong, just there's more to learn.
So maybe each Artin group has its own personality, its own set of possibilities, instead of them all following the same rule.
Exactly. That's what's so cool about this. It's like the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And that just makes it more exciting to explore.
You know, I'll admit, when we started this whole Artin group thing, I was a bit lost. But now, I'm hooked. It's like we went on a journey through, like, a hidden mathematical world.
That's the beauty of curiosity.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe someone listening right now is going to be the one to solve all this.
I love that. Someone out there having their aha moment right now because of this. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, for those of us who want to dive deeper into the nitty-gritty, what should they check out?
The paper's called Property Rees for New Classes of Artin Groups. Seriously, read it. It's a perfect example of how creative and smart these mathematicians are.
Well said. It's been a wild ride exploring the world of Artin groups, the infinite flip thing, and all the amazing ways mathematicians are trying to understand them. A huge thank you to our expert for, well, being an expert.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Always happy to geek out about this stuff.
And to all our listeners, keep those brains engaged, keep asking questions, and keep being amazed by the power of math. We'll see you next time, Deep Divers.
Ever try to solve one of those puzzles where just when you think you're getting a handle on it,
Yeah.
the rules change?
Yeah.
It's like you're about to unlock the solution,
Right.
and the entire thing just twists and turns in on itself.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're dealing with today as we take this deep dive to the world of Artin groups and this really fascinating concept called property arca.
It's a fascinating area of math.
Yeah.
And what I find so captivating about it is that it's not just some theoretical abstraction.
Right.
You know what I mean? This idea of these kind of shifting rules and these changing patterns,
Yeah.
it has these really significant implications for how we understand symmetry,
Okay.
even in these like really complex systems, you know, in dimensions that are beyond what we can even visualize, you know, on a day-to-day basis.
Wow. So let's break this down a little bit. We're dealing with this thing called twisted conjugacy.
Right.
Now, I always like to think about things in terms of like real world analogies.
Sure.
So I was thinking about this, like, how do we explain this to people?
Yeah.
Imagine if you're shuffling a deck of cards, but every time you shuffle the deck,
Yeah.
the order that the cards are supposed to move in
Yeah.
also changes.
Yeah.
So it's like the rules of the shuffle itself are
Exactly.
in flux.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So you've got this constant state of change
Absolutely.
as you're trying to understand, like, what even is the pattern here?
All right.
How does anything make sense?
Yeah. And that's where this idea of property archon comes in.
Right.
When a group, a mathematical group,
Yeah.
exhibits this property.
Okay.
It means that those twisted conjugacies,
Yeah.
those like constantly shifting arrangements,
Right.
they lead to infinite possibilities.
Wow.
So it's kind of like if you
Yeah.
can imagine like trying to predict the outcome of a coin toss,
Okay.
but the coin itself is changing every time you flip it.
Oh, wow.
So it's like a constantly moving target.
Right.
You know, you can never quite pin it down.
So in a sense, then, why does it even matter?
Yeah, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
Why should we care if a mathematical group
Yeah.
has this property or not? And I think that's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because it's not just about like,
Right.
you know, these like kind of abstract mathematical curiosities.
Uh-huh.
It's about unlocking these fundamental truths about like the nature of mathematical structures themselves.
Wow.
Particularly when we're dealing with this kind of like infinite complexity.
Okay.
So property RM can actually be like a key factor
Okay.
in determining whether certain mathematical problems are even solvable.
Wow.
It's like having a map
Okay.
that tells you if you're heading into like completely uncharted territory,
Great.
or if there's even a possibility of finding your way through.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it really is about pushing the boundaries of what we understand about math at its core.
Wow. Okay. So we're talking about these Artin groups, which are named after this mathematician, Emil Artin.
Right.
And what I find so fascinating is that these groups can actually be visualized using something as simple as braids.
Yes. You can think of braids as like a visual representation of these groups.
Okay.
So like imagine taking strands.
Okay.
It could be anything, right? And you weave them over and under each other in different patterns.
Right.
And each unique braid pattern can actually represent an Artin group.
So like the way that we braid hair
Kinda.
is like mathematically sound.
Exactly.
There's like a whole system for it.
It's not just about looking good. It's about the math behind it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they even use this really cool visual tool in the paper called a Coxeter graph.
Right.
which is basically like
It's like a blueprint
a blueprint
for each Artin group.
for each Artin group.
Yeah, and these diagrams are really crucial for mathematicians.
Okay.
Because they help us make sense of the underlying symmetries. Okay.
And relationships within these groups.
So it's like translating math into a picture.
Exactly. It's like taking this abstract mathematical language
Yeah.
and turning it into something we can actually visualize and study.
Okay, so we've got our braid,
Yeah,
we've got our blueprint,
right.
but how does this connect to the real world?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Like, are we just grading hair here?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It might surprise you to know that Artin groups actually have applications in fields like crystallography,
Okay.
where they're used to understand like the symmetrical arrangements of atoms in crystalline structures,
Wow.
and even in robotics,
Okay.
where these groups can help model and program complex movements.
So it's like you can use these braid patterns to program a robot.
In a way, yeah, it's about understanding these complex relationships and how things move and interact.
So we've got our braid, we've got our blueprint.
Right.
But what makes some Artin groups more interesting than others?
Yeah, so this paper focuses on two particularly intriguing types.
Okay.
Spherical and large hyperbolic Artin groups.
Okay.
So think of the spherical ones as being related to like the symmetries of shapes,
Okay.
but in dimensions higher than our usual 3D world.
Okay.
Like imagine a hypercube,
Okay.
a cube in 4 dimensions.
So kind of like that movie Interstellar.
Exactly. It's like trying to wrap your head around these higher dimensional spaces.
And then you've got the large hyperbolic ones.
Yeah, those are even more mind-bending.
Okay.
Imagine a space that curves in on itself infinitely,
Okay.
much like the illusions in M.C. Escher's artwork.
Understanding the structure and symmetries of these spaces
Right.
is a significant challenge for mathematicians.
And that's where these large hyperbolic Artin groups come in.
Exactly.
And this is where this paper makes a pretty big leap forward.
Yeah, they were able to prove something pretty groundbreaking about these types of Artin groups.
What did they find out?
So the big reveal, the aha moment in this paper,
Yeah.
is that they managed to prove that both spherical and large hyperbolic Artin groups
Okay.
do in fact possess this elusive property R,
And why is that such a big deal?
proving that property R holds true,
Okay.
even for specific types of Artin groups,
Okay.
is notoriously difficult.
Okay.
It's like finding a master key
Okay.
that unlocks a whole wing of a building instead of having to fiddle with each individual lock.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like proving this property for these specific Artin groups was no easy feat.
Not at all.
Did they have like a secret formula or something? How did they manage to crack this thing?
Well, their solution involved this really clever use of something called mapping class groups.
Okay.
So imagine a donut for a second.
Okay. Okay.
Right now, picture stretching and deforming that donut
Okay.
in every way you can possibly imagine,
Right.
but without tearing it apart.
Right.
So all the twists and stretches and contortions,
Yeah.
each of those transformations represents an element within the mapping class group of that donut.
Okay. I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mind-bending
So
concept.
we're talking about like how we're manipulating this donut,
Exact.
and how does that relate back to these Artin groups and property RA?
Right. So what they did is
Yeah.
they found a way to embed
Okay.
the Artin groups into these mapping class groups.
Right.
And by doing that,
Yeah.
they could then analyze those twisted conjugacies that
Yep.
we were talking about earlier.
Right, those shifting arrangements.
Exactly. They could analyze those within the context of these donut transformations.
So the way that we're like shuffling the cards or like the rules of the code are changing,
Yeah,
that's like analogous to how we're messing with this donut.
precisely.
Okay.
And what they discovered is that when you embed certain Artin groups, specifically those spherical and large hyperbolic ones,
Right.
into these mapping class groups, the actions become really intricate
Okay.
and unpredictable.
Go ahead.
They call this non-elementary action, which basically means that things get so tangled and complex
Right.
that it's incredibly hard to predict what the final outcome will be.
So we've gone from shuffling cards to twisting donuts.
Right.
But it all comes back to this idea of infinite possibilities and unpredictable outcomes.
Exactly. And that's the core of property R.
So it's really interesting how these mathematical concepts
Yeah,
could be connected to these like visual analogies.
absolutely. And that connection was key for them
Yeah.
to actually prove that these types of Artin groups have this property.
It's like finding this missing link that connects all these different ideas together.
Yeah, it's really quite elegant.
So it seems like we've climbed quite a mountain of knowledge today.
We've covered a lot of ground.
From braids to donuts and everything in between.
I'm ready for a snack. All this talk of donuts has got me craving something sweet.
But before we indulge, did this paper answer all the questions about Artin groups?
Well, in math, there are always more questions to be asked.
Right.
This paper made significant progress,
Yeah.
but there are still some mysteries out there.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, the case of the DeFi Artin group.
Okay.
That one's still puzzling mathematicians.
So there's still work to be done.
Absolutely.
This is like the never-ending story of mathematical exploration.
It's true, there's always something new to discover.
Well, there you have it, folks. Another deep dive into the fascinating world of mathematics.
It's been a pleasure as always.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.